In Marvel's Spider-Man, players seek to defend the citizens of New York as the beloved web-swinging crime fighter, not just fighting off everyday thugs, but gun-toting gangsters, technologically enhanced mercenaries, not to mention the myriad of supervillains that threaten the city's very existence. Manhattan is a superhero's playground, and in this episode of AI in Games, we discover how developers Insomniac brought New York City to life. I'm Tommy Thompson, and we're here to celebrate Marvel's Spider-Man, a series that set a new standard not just for superhero video game adaptations, but for open-world game design as a whole. As Peter Parker in the 2018 original and Miles Morales in the 2020 spin-off, players protect New York City from the machinations of the Kingpin, Mr. Negative, Oscorp, Roxxon, and more, all in a way that stays true to their comic book roots. For developers Insomniac Games, this was a monumental task. A game that took 4 years to create, but a scale and complexity completely beyond that which the studio had built to date. There are a myriad of AI systems that run throughout both Spider-Man titles, all of which designed to make New York feel alive. From the henchmen of Mr. Negative and Wilson Fisk, to the traffic that ebbs and flows through Manhattan's concrete jungle, and the everyday civilians that breathe life into the world. In this video, we're going to focus on how the AI systems work for all of these characters, and the design considerations required in order for them to work. But in addition, tune in to episode 3 of my Artifacts series, in which we'll be exploring how Insomniac built an entire procedural generation pipeline that not only helped decorate and build the entire open world map, but is responsible for the placement of crimes, NPC activities, civilians, and much more. For Insomniac Games, the big challenge in crafting enemy AI for Spider-Man was trying to constrain the scope. When we consider the variety of enemies that Spider-Man faces, this becomes immediately apparent. There are 5 major factions in the original 2018 game: random street thugs, the Kingpin's mercenaries, Mr. Negative's demon crew, the escaped prisoners of the Raft, and the Sable security teams brought in to maintain order in Manhattan. Plus, most factions typically had enemies that adhere to one of 8 archetypes: melee, shield, baton, pistol, rifle, sniper, rocket, and heavy. Not to mention enemies unique to specific factions, such as the sword wielders of the demons or the jetpack soldiers of Sable security that help mix things up even further. On top of all of this, once you add on the minor factions, such as Tombstone's thugs, Taskmaster's henchmen, and even the likes of the NYPD, and then all of these supervillain boss fights, you begin to see the problem. Insomniac estimated that they required 64 unique AI configurations in order to capture all of the design requirements, which was significantly more than the 19 classes of enemies that appeared in what was at that time their most recent game, the Xbox One title Sunset Overdrive. Insomniac's proprietary game engine runs using behavior trees, with the leaf nodes at the very bottom of the tree executed using finite state machines. It's a rather popular approach to solve the AI decision making, given you sort out the high-level problem of what to do using the behavior tree, and then the FSM is responsible for handling the practical needs of executing a particular behavior. But while this had worked well to date, it presented a big problem. Sunset Overdrive required 17 behavior trees to handle the 19 enemy archetypes. It was simply implausible for Insomniac to build enough unique systems to handle all 64 enemy classes during development and maintain them as gameplay evolved, so their approach needed a rethink. The solution was to change how the finite state machines operated. The behavior trees were consolidated to a point that there was only 13 of them, 8 for specific boss battles, and then 5 for enemy archetypes, with 4 of these being derived from a main enemy behavior tree. These trees were smaller and handle the larger behavior logic, but now specific behaviors were largely encoded within hierarchical finite state machines. But critically, much of this behavior of these state machines was data-driven, What does that mean? Well, we'll dig into that in a second. But in the meantime, if you're new to this channel and none of that technical stuff made sense, be sure to check out my AI 101 episodes on both behavior trees and finite state machines, given that will help you get an idea of what all of this technology is doing in the context of the game. So yeah, like I said, enemy AI powered by a data-driven finite state machine. Well, what on earth does that even mean? It means that rather than making a particular state handle all of the parameters and logic for a given behavior and have them hard-coded, a lot of that data was being passed in at runtime, and that makes it a lot more flexible and can be used in a myriad of circumstances. A really good example of this isn't from Spider-Man, but a game that is very famous here on this channel. In my videos detailing the AI of First Encounter Assault Recon, aka Fear, the finite state machine used for that game's goal-oriented action planner only had 3 states: move, animate, and use smart object, which was just a fancy way of saying run an animation that is tied to an object on the map, such as a table or ladder. Each of those states is incredibly vague, given the planner would create the parameters. The planner dictated where the soldier would move towards, or what smart object it should interact with. Meanwhile, actions like shooting at the player or throwing grenades were typically just considered as animations. Spider-Man takes the exact same approach, but this time it's the behavior trees, combined with the game designers, that's helping feed the parameters to the system. You know what? Let's take a look at some specific examples, given that will no doubt help make this clearer. If we consider the enemy bases that Spider-Man will attempt to clear out, such as Kingpin's construction sites or Mr. Negative's hideouts, many of the AI need to be doing specific patrols or other activities prior to Spider-Man interfering and combat kicking off. This is achieved using a behavior called Behaviour Scripted, which builds a queue of actions that the behavior tree processes into a sequence of calls to state machines to execute. Whenever an NPC has been told to use Behaviour Scripted, it would run through the queue of actions and execute them in sequence until they're finished. While this could have been achieved using a sequence in the behavior tree, by making it entirely data-driven, it means that the sequence is being generated dynamically by the data rather than being hard-coded in the tree. While this is evident at the beginning of these combat missions, the part of the game where this is arguably the most obvious is the stealth sequences with Mary Jane and Miles Morales, given it allows for AI characters to do very specific sequences of actions that satisfy the game designer's needs for those particular moments. But while this was a really useful tool for designers, the one place that this system was used more than anywhere else was in combat. Behavior Use Combo was a data-driven behavior used in combat, and enabled for all of the data required for an enemy to attack Spider-Man to be put into practice. Behavior Use Combo would use a special system of what was known as combo moves, individual attacks that an AI could trigger. In fact, there are 39 combo move types in the original 2018 game. Multiple combo moves are then stored in a combo entry, all of which is then stored in what is known as a combo config. Each combo move would trigger the AI to move between specific states of a state machine, namely standing idle, taunting Spider-Man, celebrating, turning to face a given direction, transitioning to idle, shuffling around on the spot, or running the combo move action itself. By storing multiple combo sequences in a combo config, designers could dictate all of the attacks available to an enemy, what animations they play, the wind-up time, the cooldown time between attacks, other critical information such as what conditions would allow for a specific attack to be valid, and what distance is required for that attack to become valid. These are but two of the data-driven behaviors that were available to designers, but critically for the developers, the behavior combo system meant that adding new attacks and other actions became very easy to do. Though as Adam Noonchester explained in the GDC AI Postmortem of the game, it did lead to it being a little difficult to edit at times, given it's a lot of fields needing configured inside the game engine's editor, and designers needed to be trained up on how to use it. Okay, now that I've explained the underlying AI architecture of the enemies in Spider-Man, we still need to talk about how combat itself is managed. The goal for combat was to have this fast, fluid, dynamic yet cinematic vibe. Enemies should feel dangerous to go up against, while also allowing players opportunities to improvise, changing tactics, or just get into the flow and smack everyone down with the proportional strength of a spider. So let's talk not just about how enemies decide to attack, but when they attack, how they attack, and critically how it all feels smooth in the moment. To make combat feel smooth, There's actually a secret animation system running in the game referred to as synced animations. Enemies need to run up and take a crack at Spider-Man, while Spider-Man himself needs to do the same thing. But Spidey's moveset is far more dynamic. He leaps across the combat area, web zips and kicks a guy in the face. That all needs to be synchronized such that it looks smooth and fluid. The synced animation system achieves this by having an invisible sync joint that is attached to Spider-Man at all times. So when a particular combat move is being executed by the player, the game works to ensure that both Spidey and the thug are lined up correctly, so that when the punch or kick happens, it connects like it should and it looks super smooth. There is, in fact, multiple ways that the system can be adopted, such that both characters are in the right place at the right time. Sometimes Spidey does all the movement and leaps across to make the hit, known as a guest as anchor sync joint. But there's also the external anchor, which is actually used when Spider-Man throws an enemy, given the player's input is influencing how the animations should line up and their final direction. Then there is the host as anchor configuration, where Spidey doesn't move, but the thug lines up for the shot. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is a web stealth takedown like we see on screen. The character is moved up to a fixed point in the animation, at which point the takedown actually occurs. This often has to accommodate different height differentials, given this move can be used in a variety of circumstances. So while sometimes the enemy travels farther to reach Spidey, the final takedown part of the animation always happens in the same place relative to him. Okay, so we've talked about why combat can look so smooth, but let's get into how combat is actually managed. The game runs two separate combat managers during any given encounter. The melee manager, which is responsible for any and all attacks using melee weapons, and also the ranged manager, which is for enemies that throw projectiles or use firearms. Each of these groups of enemies are managed separately, but these two systems do actually talk to each other. The two things they're focused on achieving is that combat, even at its most intense, feels fair, and the enemies are attacking in a way that looks somewhat intelligent. So how do enemies decide when to attack? Each enemy, be they melee or ranged, has a cooldown before they're allowed to attack Spider-Man, but they can't attack without permission. The game uses a token system, whereby enemies can request that their combat manager pick them for an attack job, but only if there are available job tokens for them to hold on to. The number of tokens available in a given fight impacts how many enemies can attack the player at once. The melee manager by default only allows for one attack job at any given time, while the ranged manager can have multiple jobs active at any point. This is a common idea in modern action games, and in fact we have looked at how this is used previously back in episode 30, looking at the AI of the 2016 reboot of Doom. Spider-Man adopts many of the same ideas as that game, but it's implemented differently in both the melee and ranged managers. So for example, a melee enemy can dictate their priority for an attack job. If they've been waiting for a long time to attack, and they're in an ideal position, they get priority over other enemies. Priority also takes into consideration certain enemy archetypes, most notably bosses. Hence, if a boss has henchmen and the boss wants to attack, it will get priority over everyone else. In addition, much like Doom, melee enemies can steal the active job token from one another if it makes sense. A good example of this is if an enemy was moving into position to attack, and then the player web zips across the combat area, then another thug that is closer to where Spider-Man landed can steal the token and trigger their own attack. But also, the manager can override the enemies and create proximity jobs when it recognizes that a nearby enemy should take priority. Over time, the melee manager also has a hidden intensity meter that slowly builds up over time and earns bonuses based on how well Spider-Man is performing. This then allows for special events to be triggered, like allowing simultaneous attacks by temporarily increasing the token limit, or special sequenced attacks, like when a heavy attempts to do a punch combo. There is also one other way in which the token limit can increase, and that's if the player recently dodged, but I'll come back to that in a second, given dodging has a huge impact on how both combat managers operate. In the meantime, the ranged manager is also balancing how often ranged enemies can attack, with cooldowns on firing weapons being much longer than regular melee attacks, but it has a variety of unique conditions for selecting enemies and how they subsequently behave. By default, the ranged manager will prioritize an enemy that's on screen. Given if multiple enemies are armed with guns, it makes sense to have the one facing the player take a shot, but it still permits enemies who are off-screen to attack the player, but with a delay. You'll notice that when an enemy plans to shoot you, Your spider sense is projected on screen to help communicate that the shot is about to occur, so you can time your dodge. If the enemy is on screen, that delay is only 3/4 of a second, but if the character is off screen, it's doubled to 1.5 seconds. But while the attack cooldowns are much longer for ranged enemies, there is one condition that changes it, and that's if Spider-Man starts attacking from the air. The range manager maintains an air aggression meter that adds a probability to end a character's attack cooldown prematurely based on how frequently you're attacking in the air. This adds a bit more risk to aerial combat and forces you to prioritize ranged enemies more if you're in the air, given every attack committed in the air increases the chance of enemy cooldown ending early by 50%. But even with all this combat management in place, during development, internal playtesting found that quite often the combat felt very cheap. Players felt it was too easy to be ganged up on, or for enemies to successfully hit Spider-Man when they're both attacking at the same time. This led to two final adjustments. First of all, the developers added a new rule. Specific actions by the player could cancel attacks in either the melee or range manager that had not been started yet, given it would imply that the enemies were having trouble keeping tabs on Spider-Man's movement. Originally, the plan was for this to focus solely on dodging, but actually it has a long list of actions that can influence it. So yes, dodging counts, and yes, perfect dodging counts too, but then also using a web strike or a web throw, air launching an enemy, using a finisher, jumping off an enemy, just jumping, and landing, and actually taking a hit from an enemy. This system does, however, have a failsafe, in that if you spam certain actions repeatedly, it will ignore them. So you can't just jump around like an idiot and nobody bothers to attack you. But it does allow for multiple successful dodges, given that's very in keeping with Spider-Man's fighting style. However, if it's a boss battle, then it will ignore all of the dodges. The second change, which is super critical to why Spider-Man's combat feels so smooth, is a system called Beat to the Punch. If the player and an enemy are going to try and attack one another, there's a system running under the hood that analyzes each character's animation to predict which would hit the other first. In the event the difference is small enough, it will hard override the result and ensure that Spider-Man's attack will always connect first. This doesn't mean you win every one-to-one moment, but it does mean the enemies getting away with cheap hits is reduced drastically and places much more emphasis on the player's ability rather than dumb luck. So far in this video, all we've talked about is the AI of the enemy characters, but we've missed out something rather significant. The civilians who wander around New York City and frequently get caught up in Spider-Man's adventures, while they're just, trying to get to work. I honestly don't understand why anyone would want to live in New York in the Marvel Universe, but anyway. Originally, civilian AI was going to be implemented as dumb characters that moved around slowly and were limited in number, but this idea was nixed pretty quickly, given that it worked fine when Spider-Man's swinging through the streets up high, but as soon as you're down on the ground, the city would look barren and empty, which is most certainly not how New York is in real life. The original pedestrian system would have civilians act as fully processing non-player character AI, but this created a different problem, in that the 2018 game could only handle around 30 full NPC AI processes at once, while ensuring it maintained the 33 millisecond frame processing rate that the tech team was enforcing. This immediately becomes a problem as soon as you're in a densely populated area of the city, or if a crime or story event takes place in the densely populated area, as civilians run around in a panic as Spidey faces off against a gang of armed thugs. Hence the game uses a highly aggressive level of detail or LOD system that ensures only the characters that need to be acting intelligently will do so, while everyone else is doing just enough to maintain the fiction. This meant that when the game was shipped, Marvel Spider-Man could have up to 2,000 pedestrians wandering the city at the same time. The trick with any level of detail system is to prioritize based on distance and interaction, a topic I explored not that long ago with the Plague Tale games, which figured out how to get thousands of rats on screen at once, with each running simple AI behaviours. In any given scenario, there is anywhere between 200 and 400 real pedestrians acting in New York City at once. The game can only render around 200 of them at once, and even then, only around 100 of them will be fully animated, with the game prioritising those closest to the player. In fact, the game uses a highly aggressive culling technique, meaning that as soon as a civilian is no longer on screen, it will stop animating them to save resources. These front-facing civilians operate in one of two ways depending on their configuration. There are low-level civilians that run away from conflict, but also wave at the player or take pictures if you're walking past. And then there are high-intensity civilians. These are low-level AI that, for a very short time, are promoted to fully active non-player characters. These are typically used for things like high fives, which are another synced animation, much like combat, or they'll be reporting a nearby crime or point of interest, or, in even rarer cases, trigger an ambush and spawn in enemies. But what about the rest of the city? Well, outside this limit of 400 pedestrians, the game will have anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 fake pedestrians, nicknamed puppets. These puppets aren't even fully rendered or animated. They're low-bake character models that shimmy around a little on the spot, just enough that from a distance you think they're moving around, and all in an effort to help bring the city to life. All of these civilians are loaded in and out of the city based on the secret tiling system that runs in the game engine, prioritizing the high-quality assets near Spider-Man and unloading everything else when it's not needed. To find out more about how that works, check out the aforementioned Artifacts episode dedicated to Spider-Man and its procedural generation workflow. Okay, that's a lot of stuff to cover in one video, huh? This one's been a lot of work actually. To prepare this episode, I went through over a dozen sources and hours of content. Please support the show, pals, this stuff takes time. But to keep this video fun and engaging, naturally some stuff gets left on the cutting room floor. Unless, of course, I tell you all of them very quickly. Hold on to your butts, it's time for a speed round! First up, the team that builds the AI for Marvel's Spider-Man is technically the gameplay team. They also handle all of the combat and relevant mechanics for interacting with NPCs. In fact, this is markedly similar to how it was done in that other critically acclaimed superhero series, the Batman Arkham franchise by Rocksteady Games. Speaking of the dev team, while this was, to quote Insomniac's Ellen Ruskin, the biggest responsibility they had ever faced, the gameplay programming team was actually smaller than that on Sunset Overdrive. Returning to enemy AI, thugs will often deliberately stand underneath perch points or have patrols that wander past them, enabling for easier takedowns. Plus, enemies will also frequently stand near interactables to once again make it easier for you to get that cool takedown moment and save the city from evil. On the subject of taking down enemies, in earlier builds of the game, Spider-Man quipped much more and often made jokes as he took down regular goons, just like in the comics. While much of this is kept in for the bigger boss battles, most of it was toned down or stripped out for regular combat, given the developers began to find it incredibly annoying as the same lines of dialogue were repeated again, and again, and again. Also, there's an entire procedural webbing system that was built to ensure that when you web up an enemy, notably with the likes of impact webs, that the web covers and sticks to the surface as naturally as possible. It's really neat, if not, a little sticky. All of the components in the game engine actually run concurrently, meaning all animation is processed, then all AI is processed, and it actually made it difficult for the developers to dictate the order in which enemy AIs act in a given frame. The positioning of enemies during combat is reliant on a gradient descent hill climber algorithm, with placement occurring on an inner and outer ring, with ranged enemies often sticking to the outside. Enemies prioritize being inside the navigation mesh, not overlapping with each other, but also not being too close to Spider-Man himself. As the difficulty of the game increases, the AI largely stays the same. It's just the timing of attacks and cooldown between attacks that gets adjusted. This isn't just customized per difficulty level. Each faction has customized difficulty settings, and the game itself has difficulty adjustments for the AI that kick in as you move between story acts. Ranged attacks in particular have increased accuracy the higher the difficulty you've selected, but regardless of difficulty level, the first shot fired from a ranged attack will always miss. Remember how I said there are 39 unique combo move types in the game? Around 50% of them are built solely for the boss battles. There's only 2 bosses that don't use them, the Shocker and Mr. Negative, but only for his boss fight in the subway. On that note, given you fight some bosses more than once, they technically have multiple AI configurations and code bases to address how they behave in each interaction, notably Mr. Negative, who you wind up fighting on 3 separate occasions throughout the campaign. All of the AI code for pedestrian civilians runs on the one thread. Why? Because it kinda worked, and it stayed within the frame budget, and you know what? No more questions. Earlier I stated that the game can only handle around 30 active AIs at the same time. This doesn't just factor in the civilian AI, it also includes the traffic. That's AI too, You'll sometimes notice civilians hanging out and completing some sort of activity together, like shooting hoops or having a drink. These are technically called vignettes and are all handled by the game's procedural workflow I discuss in my other Spider-Man video. Some enemies fly, which is a pain in the ass because navigation meshes don't support flight, see my AI 101 video. So while Electro and Vulture fly around everywhere, Their navigation paths are entirely hand-authored by designers. Meanwhile, the other flying enemies, the jetpack soldiers from Sable International, technically follow the navigation mesh with a vertical offset, even when they don't really need to. And this also means the entire combat sequence when Mr. Negative attacks the armoured Sable truck had to rely on a custom solution, given none of the AI was built to support it. And last but not least, players will have noticed when you wander around near civilians, you can't punch them. You simply wave and do finger guns. No, the gameplay logic hasn't changed. You're still trying to trigger a punch. The devs simply swap the punch animation out for when there's no enemies nearby and you're surrounded by civilians. While Sony's first-party offerings are often highly regarded, Insomniac's Spider-Man series not only set a new standard for superhero video games, but elevated the studio's status as one of the most critically acclaimed teams in the industry. But as we've seen today, the level of detail and effort to achieve their creative vision was no small feat, and even now, I'm only giving a small insight into the level of creativity and technical ingenuity required to bring it all to life. Insomniac understood the assignment, that with great power, there must also come great responsibility. I'm sorry, I just needed to get that line in the script somewhere. Thank you so much for watching this bumper 74th issue of AI in Games. Spider-Man has been a topic I've been wanting to cover for a very long time, but frankly I was a little spooked by the challenge of putting it all together. In fact, I'm incredibly grateful now that I created the Artifact series, given I can then dedicate an entire video to looking at Insomniac's procedural generation workflow. At the time of this video's release, the Artifacts episode isn't live yet, but what better excuse to subscribe to the channel and stick around for more, as it will be live very soon. My work here on AI in Games is brought to you in large part thanks to my crowdfunding supporters. They support my work, help me continue to do what I do. If you've enjoyed this video, please check out the links in the description and find out how you can sponsor the show via Patreon, YouTube or Substack. And with that, I've got more videos to write, and probably need to go make some space on my PS5's hard drive for Spider-Man 2. But in the meantime, y'all take care of yourselves, and I'll be back.